Hello, writers and crafters. I'm Valerie Isan.
And I'm Eric Mertz.
And this is episode 60. Yay!
I love
That
round
seems like,
numbers.
I know, it sounds like a landmark episode. It is March 23rd, 2022, as we record this. And today we're going to talk about setting and world building and all that goes into that. The podcast is sponsored by our patrons at patreon.com/Valerie Isan, IHSAN. For as low as $1 a month, you can get a shout out on the podcast and we can make announcements for you. At other tiers, the benefits really shoot up. There's accountability Zoom calls, scene analysis, like free coaching. There's a lot of stuff there. So go check out patreon.com/Valerie Isan. There is only 1 week left for registration for the Writercraft writing retreat and workshop. That closes April 2nd, so I can secure the venue. So please go to the website, valerieisans.com/retreat, and check out the monthly payment plan. And if you've got any questions, you can always email us. So, Eric, what's been going on?
Well, it's what am I reading? That's a lot.
Reading and what's going on.
Well, I'm reading. I don't read much memoir. I think I read more memoir than I think I do. When I look at my year end, I realize I read more. But whenever I pick one up, I think, oh my, wow, I'm reading a memoir. This is cool. I'm checking out comedy drama. The Bob Odenkirk's new memoir. He's the Better Call Saul, the actor who plays Saul Goodman, Jimmy McGill from the Breaking Bad world. Talk about world building. So I've been in a real, I've been into comedians lately. I've been into what makes comedians work, and so reading his memoir has been really real interesting view on just what being a comedian and trying to write funny is like. How hard that is. He talks a lot about he just would write 100 jokes a day and hope that one worked, and that sounds really intimidating to me. So yeah, that's what I'm reading, and I'm just getting through some writing. I'm working on a prequel book. Unexpectedly found myself writing a different story, and I'm loving it. So
oh, cool. A different story, as in the different from what you're working on, or is it still in the strange air mystery?
It is in the same world. So in the newest novel, Chasing Shadows, Melville hooks up with a writer who becomes sort of Sandoval. Yeah, he becomes his sort of paranormal mystery co-detective, there. And I kept thinking, what is this guy's story? I really want to know who Sandoval is, partly because I've known who Melville is forever. And I was fun to dive into somebody else. So I thought, I'll write a short story about Sandoval's past, what got him into the paranormal. And now I'm 75,000 words into it.
Oh my God.
It just keeps coming.
That is a fantastic short story.
Yeah, it's
that's an epic short story.
That's an epic. It's the longest short story ever. So yeah, it evolved. Then it was going to be a series of short stories, interconnected short stories, and then when I mapped out how the whole story ends, I just had to say, all right, this is a novel. This is I just wrote a book without even knowing it, really.
That's amazing. I wish that would happen more often, oh, surprise, I just wrote a book. Whoa. I've only done that one other time, but it wasn't that long. It was a nonfiction thing that I was working on, and I was just typing up some notes for a class that I was going to teach. And then I was like, oh, wait a minute, this is a book.
This is a book.
Surprise.
I feel like when all my books get together later in life, this one's going to say, it's like a big family. This one's going to say, I was an accident. And then, and then everyone will pat it on the head and say, oh, you're so cute. But no, it's been fun. He's a new character. He's a new person. It's a new world. It's a variation on the old world. And it's been a lot of fun. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Can't wait to read it all the way through, because I never thought of it as
Uh-huh.
being something to read all the way through. So what's going on with you?
Well, I finished reading Bodywork by Melissa Febos and realized that in my own memoir, I have missing scenes. And
Hmm.
some of those missing scenes are ones that I don't even know are missing. And some of them are ones I've deliberately left out
Hmm.
because I was too like embarrassed or shamed, to go there.
Hmm.
And this book, Bodywork, made me realize that I was being too safe in the memoir, and
Hmm.
I'm telling a story of my story, and I need to be more there in the pages, and that's a little uncomfortable. um
Wait,
because
when you say uncomfortable, do you mean uncomfortable that you wrote it believing that it was all there and now you're recognizing it, or the recognition that how far you have to go?
well, both actually, but I
Okay.
first meant like, ooh, it's going to be uncomfortable to dive to that depth.
Right.
And I like the narrative that I've told myself about my story.
Hmm.
So I have to go to darker, more, well, ugly places,
Hmm.
and that doesn't sound comfortable in the sense that I know that people that know me are going to read this and then know this
Right.
about me, but that's the whole point of writing a memoir.
Right. Right.
So yeah, there's some extra work that needs to be done, and yes, it will take longer, and that's always frustrating for me because I have that type A drive that
Right.
wants to
Right.
get stuff done and cross things off my list, and now this has become a bigger list, but I think it will tie in nicely to our topic today.
Oh, nice segue. Good job.
Because so setting and world building, because I don't write fantasy, I thought, well, that just doesn't apply to me. There is no, I don't need to build a world. My characters are just in the one we live in. Everybody knows about
Right.
that. But that's totally not true.
Right.
World building still encompasses the world that the character lives in, whether it's Chicago or Albany, Oregon, or, Jackson City, whatever,
Yeah. 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 It doesn't
So
matter.
that is I haven't been to like Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I don't know what the world is like over there. So if your
Right.
novel takes place there, then bring it. I want to see what the sunsets look like. I want to know how people interact with others on the street as you're walking by. Do you look at people when you walk by them on the street? Do you say hello? I lived in Kalispell, Montana for a few
Mm.
years in my 20s, and it's a small rural rural town, and the entire at the time that I lived there anyway, the entire population of the state of Montana did not equal the population of like Portland, Oregon.
Right.
Everybody's really spread out there. So if you see anybody, you're talking to them, you're waving to them, whatever.
Right.
Even when you're driving, raise your hand off the steering wheel and just, acknowledge or nod to the other person, and the other driver does the same. And and when I came here and started doing that, the people in the car I'd be driving with would say, "Oh, did you know that person?" No, you just wave. And they thought that was really weird. So world building encompasses things like that too.
Yeah.
Um,
There was
and
a
Go
there was a
ahead.
screenwriting class in at one of the Willamette Writers conferences. I don't remember which one, but the when they talked about world building, they put it in a way that I could really grasp, and that was New York is not just New York. If you watch a Marty Scorsese movie like Goodfellas and a Woody Allen movie like Manhattan, that's the same city, but it's
Mm,
not the same world. And
mhm,
so that really opened, because I love both of those directors and both of those movies, but it really outlined how important it is to, even if you, the assumption of a place is a, it can be really a challenge for a writer. If you assume that the reader knows your New York,
mhm.
you, because they've seen New York and other things, that can be a really, that can lead you down the wrong path, right? Because you're not carving out your own version of it. If everybody thought of Montana as I don't know, what's the biggest city in Montana? Missoula or something? Billings.
I don't even know anymore.
Right. But even in a place like Montana, like we're small town Montana versus the city Montana, there's going to be slight differences. There's going to
Mhm.
be, so you have to carve that. You can't take for granted that your reader knows those things.
Right. And if you're worried about like being stereotypical,
Oh,
then
right.
you can always go down a layer or five and get into, I mean, it becomes, it's not stereotypical if you are talking about a person and their response to their surroundings, because
Right.
that is individual. So that can't be stereotypical if you are writing it with authenticity.
So talk about what you just said, because I think I grasp it, but I think it, so we say go down a layer or two or five.
Mhm.
So when you're talking about getting past the stereotype is the surface level that everybody recognizes, right? That
Yeah.
might,
That instant categorization of, oh, this
right,
is what New
cowboy
York
walking
looks
down,
like. This is what
right,
Montana looks like. Yeah.
right. So when you talk about layers going down, how do you think about that?
Um, I think it is opening the door so that the reader can see parts of the world that they wouldn't normally see if they were just watching it on TV or if they were just driving through to the next town. You know, it's so they can see past that surface level. And you can do that by, I mean, in a very like surface level, you could do that by naming streets, you know, turning
Right,
down Broadway instead of he drove down the road, you know, so that
right.
people can see it, and showing the reader like what stores are on the street,
Mm,
or you know, weather is always a setting that I never remember to put in my stories. Or
right,
when I do remember, it's like this throw off of, oh, it was raining or it was gray outside. And then if I only
right.
do that like once every 3 chapters, then it just looks like it's raining and gray the
Raining all
entire
the
book.
time. Yeah, yeah,
So when I go in and add setting, I have to go in after I've written the book and add it in deliberately to all the scenes, or you know, thereabouts. So that's like one layer of depth for world building. But then I would think, you know, if you can get down into the cultural world that the character lives in and reacts
yeah. There you
to,
go. That's
and
the
I
rich stuff.
yeah, and you have, that takes more research. So if you haven't actually lived it yourself, then you know you do run the risk of stereotyping even the culture. So being mindful of, you know, is this an accurate representation of the way a person would react in this world? What are the problems in this world? What are the, what makes it broken? What makes it not work? Why is there conflict between the character and the world he lives in? And I think, to me, those are the layers that you can get to when you're world building.
Right.
Does that answer your
Yeah,
question?
yeah. It does. It does.
You don't sound
I think that,
satisfied.
well, it's because it's a complicated process, right? You're talking about, um, so you're talking about that mythical street, right, or that fictional
Mm-hmm.
street, and so, you know, we're talking a Montana scene. You have a guy in a flannel shirt, belt buckle, boots. He's a stereotype cowboy.
Drives a truck.
Drives a truck, walks down that street. I mean, I've got one of these guys
Mm-hmm.
in my story, right? So
Mm-hmm.
how do you? So, but where to me, it's so I hear what you're saying. Like you walk down the street, you name the street, you name the businesses. You start to add the layers of
And
personal
that's
memory,
setting. That's setting. And also
right?
world building. So setting, I think, is part of world building, but world
Yes,
building encompasses so much more.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the where I conceive of world building, it's where the story and the setting and the character all come together. It's in that Venn
Mm.
diagram. They all
Mm-hmm.
overlap in that place. It's the thing you can't extract. It's that the character is in a town. Maybe there's a memory there that invokes a wound that they have to, and that the setting, they can't, until they leave, that walking around that corner where they get their heart broken is always going to bring up that memory, that kind
Mm.
of thing, right? So
Hmm.
when they're that inextractable overlap in the Venn diagram is where you start doing world building. And but there is that, I think that even in our levels of experience, I mean, we're talking about it in a thoughtful, like, it's hard to talk about it with authority no matter what your experience is, because it's unique to every story you write. And to me, I always run up against, how am I doing too much of it sometimes? Am I, every time a character gets out of a car in a parking lot, do we have to know the story of the restaurant they're walking into? Do we have to have a memory of what used to be across the street? I struggle sometimes with, and I hear it from my writers group a lot, like, we don't need that little extra jaunt down memory lane. Keep on that line. Um,
I think that
so
depends on, I mean, it's just like any other scene, right? If it
right.
doesn't carry the story forward or tell us about the character, then maybe it's not necessary. And I love to read books where the setting is a character, becomes a
Oh yeah, me
character.
too.
Um, and that world that is created by the author is another character. And it can be in conflict with other characters.
Right.
And it comes with its own past and its own culture. And I really love that when I find that in novels. So I aspire to write that. But
Oh
strangely,
yeah.
I have that. I mean, the rough draft doesn't have any of that in there. So it doesn't
Right.
come naturally for me at all. I have to go in. And so I work through layers myself. If you want to get into the nitty gritty, I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
I do want to name that street, and I do want to know, like, what season, just timeline wise, like, what
Oh yeah.
season is this? How long does this book last? The story, is this over the course of a week? Is it over the course of a year? Is it a season? What season is that? Are there holidays? And what makes it a little more realistic is, I don't think about, like, if it takes place in December and it's cold and rainy and gross and everyone's plugged into their happy light so that they can stay alive. But, other things that happen in December that maybe I am not, like, we're not a big Christmas celebrator in our family. We gave, when I divorced with my husband, he took Christmas and I took solstice, and the kids
Mm,
are gone now. So, I light a candle on solstice, but it's not like I go buy presents for a whole bunch of people, or,
right.
and my husband is Turkish, and, Christmas wasn't really a holiday that you celebrated in Turkey, but New Year's Eve totally is. So that's where my attention goes. But so I would forget to write, like, other holiday stuff into a December scene. If there's a character running downtown to go grab something because blah, 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 whatever, it's part of the story. But because it's December, maybe they have a lot of traffic. Maybe there's,
Right.
stupid carols playing in, the Muzak grocery
Right.
store or whatever. I don't know. But that's another layer of setting that would add realism also. Um, I have a, so I
Well, I
have
had a
a,
question before
oh,
you
yeah,
go
yeah.
there. Let me just, because I think that as you having more of an editorial brain, when you read a story and you're aware of that, of the author is building their world, do you feel as though there is a natural winnowing down of world building as the story plot and character advance towards their confrontation, their final end? In that,
Winnowing down. What do you mean by that?
well, like in the beginning when you're building those first few chapters, right, you're setting up, this is the street, this is the corner where this happened, this is why he's not just a cowboy with boots and a flannel, he's a three-dimensional person. That's your world building, right? But as that confrontation, as that character's moving towards that confrontation, the big story climax, do you find that, like, well orchestrated stories start to peel away some of that layer? You don't, when they're running down the street to have that confrontation, you're not naming the business that's on the corner because they're focused on that thing. Do you
Hmm.
feel like that's something that good books do, or do you think that you're consistently building that world up to the final conflict?
I think There's a consistent build, but mindful of the pacing. Like you said, you're not going to
Right.
describe this setting if, they're running from a killer.
Right.
But
Stop,
if,
pause. Oh, I know that store. I've been there before. I had my first her birthday party there.
right.
Moving on. Right.
No, but there is a point in trauma, like when
Mm,
it's happening, where you do get really micro. So
hmm.
if you are like in a car accident and you're waiting for someone to, you know, get you out of the car, you're
Right.
going to see like what's right in front of your face and like
Right.
everything else is going to stop. So that's a place for setting that would be really effective, I think, because there is that like everything stops and you're focused on this one thing. Um, like when my husband died, the house was full of people. I was sitting in a chair in the kitchen right by the phone, and somebody asked if I wanted a bagel. Like totally random. It didn't carry a
Right.
story forward, nothing. Like, I mean, it did show like people milling around and trying to be useful, which is totally authentic to
Right.
sudden death and grief and the family not knowing what to do. But it was funny to me later that was
Right.
the
Right.
thing that stuck in my head.
Right.
So yeah, you're going to micro down in moments of like not when they're being chased by the killer, but maybe they're hiding now
Right.
and there's behind a tree, and the bark is like pushed up against their face and it feels like, blah blah blah. So yes, I think that the world building is going to happen all throughout strategically, and it's
Right.
better that way than to info dump world building at the beginning of your book, which is really boring to read.
Right. Right. Well, I like what you said, and I'm sorry I cut you off because I know you were going somewhere, but I think that mindful of pacing is what I was thinking of. Is that
Mm-hmm.
idea that it's not always the same. You can't treat every street corner the same way. And look, I mean, what you're describing is, I don't know, the Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, the Stephen King book, which is not a great Stephen King book, but it does takes that idea that like building a world is different in your everyday, and then when you're in a trauma state, when
Mm-hmm.
you're in that state of hiding, which is what the girl's in, like she's been lost and she's remembering and thinking of things that just wouldn't make sense, but it's part of the world, is like
Mm-hmm.
she's in a traumatic state.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's important to know, because pacing is something you have. We've talked about this before too. We have to do everything we're talking about simultaneously in a good book, right? You have to build the character, build the story, build mindful of pacing. So it's an orchestration.
Mm-hmm. I think that the the places that I'm personally interested in right now in developing in my own craft, because I feel lacking in it, and
Mm,
because I'm at that stage of writing this manuscript where, okay, now I'm going to start putting this in, is, I always called it like the settings pass, but it's also a sensory pass too.
mm-hmm,
So yes, we've got like the 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 five senses, and we are a predominantly like visual, I wanted to say culture, but that doesn't sound like the right word to use, but most of what,
animal.
yeah, I
We're a visual
guess.
animal, right?
There
I
you
mean,
go.
as opposed to a dog.
Yeah. So it's easy for us to write down what the character sees, or what a reader would see as if they were watching a movie. So it's
Right.
quite easy to add sight as a sense to our books. But I think a lot of us, forget about like smell. Or
Right.
I read a book a couple months ago about a profoundly deaf person. And so there was no sound in the entire book on purpose
Mm-hmm.
because
Right.
she couldn't hear anything. So that was really interesting. It was kind of a removal of us of setting, but deliberate. And it created, um, I don't know, the setting became more special in a way. And I
Right.
was more
Right.
focused as a reader on what she could see because she couldn't hear anything. So other than going through and adding different senses. What does this scene smell like? Whatever. And you can't, I think a person could probably overkill that. You don't want
Yes.
to add like what every scene smells like. I think that would be a little bit like jarring, I think, or not jarring, but just noticeable to the reader. And you really want your reader to not notice that they're reading a book.
Right. Right. That's the goal.
That's the goal. So, and then we talked a little bit about the weather and the season, like how much time has passed. So that's another thing to think about, I guess, when you're adding scenes or adding senses to the scenes and setting. But also the ones that I don't think about at all, and I think would be actually very good for writing memoir, for instance, but also maybe psychological thrillers or something where there's a lot of not just felt senses, but also that like extrasensory perception. Or,
Hmm.
if you're writing a paranormal mystery, there's
Right.
got to be a little bit of one of the characters at least has to be like kind of in tune to that. Like, oh,
Right.
what does
Yeah.
this room feel like? Or, is there is somebody psychic? I mean, that's kind of a
Right.
stereotypical thing, but maybe, they rely on their intuition a lot or just, yeah, their perceptions can be
Right.
added in. And that's part of setting too. That's part of
Right.
world building and
And
characterization.
character. Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I always feel like with paranormal, you have to like the conflict, the main conflict I think in paranormal stories is always belief versus disbelief, right? I mean, the X-Files made an entire franchise off of that, the tension there. And I think somebody's got to believe, and that belief has to come from that extrasensory something. They have to, in the five senses, they have to find that sixth sense that tells them there's something more here. So,
Yeah. And that creates a really fun and interesting conflict between characters too. Like in the show Lost, there
mm,
was the surgeon who was very
right.
like scientific. And then there was John, I forget his name, but he was the
John
one
Locke.
that John Locke, yeah, he was all about faith. He was
Right.
the one that could walk suddenly. He was in a wheelchair
Right.
before he crashed and now he can walk. So
You're gonna make me watch that show again, and I don't have that time. I love that show. I love it.
I loved like
You
the first maybe 3 seasons, and then I was like kind of watching it because I had to, like,
you
okay,
were
what's
doing
the
the
end going to be?
dance.
And at the end, I was just like, oh, yeah,
I thought the last episode was great. Now that's a controversial topic for another day,
totally.
because some people hate that. You said something about when you talked about the senses, and I was reading those Jeffrey Deaver short stories, and
Mhm,
one of those short stories in the first paragraph describes the smell of it's like a hostage situation takes place in a restaurant, and it in an old restaurant, and it at a in a seacoast resort town kind of thing. And
mhm,
there was one sentence that described the smell, and it was like the mix of briny salt water and old fryer grease or something. It was perfect.
mhm,
And for 30 pages of a short story, that sense impression stayed. So when you talked
mhm,
about overkill, I thought of that. Like if you're using especially smell, because if you hit that right note with smell, people
mhm.
will just
Smell it.
like, yeah, they'll smell it. It's usually something unpleasant,
Uh-huh.
or overwhelmingly pleasant, like potpourri. Like when that word comes out, I can smell that grandma living room. Um, so I think again, there's one, you don't have to do that in every scene, and if you
Mhm.
don't want that reader going, oh wow, they're doing their check down. Here's what it looked
Yeah.
like, smelled like, tasted like. Which, yeah, tasted like could be really awkward if someone's always eating something. But balance, got to have that balance, and you have to trust that, like, when if you're going to hit somebody with a strong sensory something, that it carries through. You don't
Mhm.
want the reader knowing they're in a book. You want them to feel like they're in the experience.
So, Eric, as
Oh
a
boy.
fantasy writer and
Mm-hmm.
a paranormal writer,
Mm-hmm.
your world building is different than my world building.
Very different, yeah, I would
So,
say.
what is different about world building for a fantastical story or audience?
I'm glad you put it that way, because I think that to sit here and go through science fiction and fantasy and paranormal and horror and all those things, it would, I think there's a lot of overlap between those things.
Oh, yeah.
So I think for one, I think there has to be something that is like, you have to build the normal world for one thing, right? And
Okay.
I think even you see that in fantasy books. Fantasy and sci-fi are a little different because like you're building a imaginary real world. So I
Like
think
another planet or another
right,
land or,
right. I think the key to doing that well is, again, you're not spending a lot of time info dumping. You're not spending a lot of time like over describing something. You are describing the room on the spaceship as though these things are normal. It's just this is the normal set of new things that your characters are interacting with. The same way you would describe the bar in that town in Montana that might be familiar to your reader, but you're describing how the people interact with that. I think the first thing is there has to be a baseline, and you have to establish what that baseline is and treat it like the baseline. Because again, that's where your reader is going to know that you're pointing at things and trying to highlight them too much. So just
say
set
more
the
about
scene.
baseline.
Well, again, if the spaceship is whatever that unique element you've created, whatever you're calling the technology, whatever is on the spaceship, right? Like if it's a prison ship or if it's a science ship, you're creating a baseline understanding of the setting, right? That there's a laboratory here, there's a prison cell there, there's red lights that run the hall of
And it
corridors,
has
whatever
to
they
be
are.
artfully told as well. You can't just info dump that, there's red
Right.
lights that line the blah, blah, blah. And it would be more, I would assume, the character walking through and interacting with the setting as he's going about his action.
I try to think of it as just it's the same thing, and the cowboy example is perfect. It's the same thing as that cowboy walking down the street, interacting with I need to pick up something at the store. There's my car. There's those things that we do when we're interacting with our street. Your character's doing the same thing in those fantastical settings, and I think you can tell when a writer trusts that they're building that spaceship, that fantasy world, because it feels just like that person walking down the street. Now, that being said, all of those genres, I think, readers demand that there's an elevation at a certain point in those settings, right? The spaceship is going to do something that nobody's ever seen, and it's going to transform and go into hyperspace, or something's going, you're going to find out something new about it. There's going to be a new thing to interact with. Same thing with fantasy, right? You're in this village, everybody's eating a meal, sitting around, listening to the band. Something's going to come in and interrupt that setting. Mystery, something's going to shatter the stasis of that street. In all those places, I think the genres demand that that's done a certain way, right? It's got to be, one's got to be scientific, another one's got to be, very fantastical, probably involving magic or a creature no one's seen. Mystery, it's got to involve some sort of like, crime or intrigue or a clue revelation. So I think that it's, again, you're setting that baseline setting for the reader to trust in. And as you're moving forward, you can start to do things with that. And you can tell a fantasy story that needs some development, or science fiction that needs development, when the author is trying to catch up with that. Oh, let me remind you about how this works because it's about to change. Building all of that up, that normal interaction, I think is so key, because you want the focus in those heightened moments to be on what is changing, what is different, what is threatening the character and their world.
So it's been said before in our industry that the Harry Potter books were a great way to introduce a new world without the info dumping, because it started with
fantastic,
an ordinary dude.
Right.
And so he got to experience everything that the character, or that the reader, I said that backwards. The reader gets to experience everything that Harry Potter experienced. And so that awe and wonder that he saw at all these new, wild, fantastical things is the same as the reader. So if you are not bringing an ordinary person into an extraordinary world, and you're starting with an extraordinary character in an extraordinary world,
Right.
I guess how do you avoid that info dumping? I think you alluded to it a little bit, just like take them through their ordinary world. And I guess what I'm trying to ask is, I like to read books that take me to a place I've not been before, whether
Right.
it's like historical Holland or like
Right.
whatever. So I want to go to a place I haven't been before, and I want to walk the streets with the character. So
Right.
how do we write that without, well, without
Info
info
dumping.
dumping, I guess. I
Right.
guess maybe that's the word I'm afraid of.
Well, Harry Potter is a perfect example because I'm reading them for the first time with my 7-year-old kid, and I'm on book number, I'm on the Goblet of Fire.
Mhm.
And Goblet of Fire is actually a really great way to have this conversation because the first Harry Potter is right, new guy in town, so everything is new to him, and the author gets to reveal those things, and that's your first book,
Mhm.
right? Because by the second book, he or she is not the new person in town anymore. They have that little bit of experience. And what I think J.K. Rowling did really well is she always shook up that beginning of the book a little bit. Yes, we always started in Privet Drive in some way, but the circumstances in Privet Drive were a little different. And Harry's access to Hogwarts changed a little bit every time. And there was always a layer in that first act that allowed the writer, now I'm just thinking about it from her craft perspective, there was always an element in that first act that allowed her to reintroduce things, right? In Goblet of Fire, there's the Quidditch Cup at the beginning of the book, which as I'm reading it to my kid, he's like, this is terrible, they're not at Hogwarts. But I kept thinking, like, there's a device, she's doing something here,
Mhm.
and because she's a good writer, um, I didn't know what it was. Now that I'm reaching the end, I recognize what she was doing. She was, she was world building for this book.
Mhm.
So I think that if you are suggesting sort of series mentality or like longer, you know,
Not
not think.
necessarily.
Oh, I feel like if you're talking about genres, I think that it walks that line. Like
Yeah.
I think it's always introducing things in book sense, like just varying your introduction. Because if it's always new, like that old western where like it's a new, the new sheriff in town storyline is just, it doesn't work episode after episode. You have to vary like what the challenges are, and it'll let that varied challenge that you introduce your character to in the beginning gives you an opportunity. I mean, I'm doing that in Chasing Shadows, where I've introduced Melville, he's out there. Now I have to shift up a little bit of how he's getting into this mystery. And in the next one, I'm going to have to shift how he's getting into that mystery so that it never feels like I'm introducing those uncanny paranormal mystery elements the same way. Because then the reader's going to be like, flipping digital pages or print pages because the world's been built for them. I think that, is a key. Like you have to treat, even though you might be sharing a world, you have to change up what that world looks like a little bit, introduce new elements of it, or it's just going to be the same old Hogwarts every time. And
Mhm.
it's really not. The interaction on Goblet of Fire with Hogwarts is different than every other book that I've read so far, right? It feels different. Harry isn't walking a different, we're not talking as much about classrooms. He's always in the shadows and the fringes, and it's different than the first book. Whole different world, and you're relying on your reader knowing that to get you there.
There's so many things that I wanted to say to that, and I have forgotten
I
about
know.
3 of them.
I think I talked for like 3 minutes there about 50 topics, but
So let's see. This will be in no particular order.
I'm sure.
I did want to circle back to when you are, so I write standalones. I don't write in series.
Right.
So I can't rely on, I mean, I still have to trickle in the world building.
Right.
So I guess my concern as a standalone novelist is to introduce the world in a, okay, so Harry Potter then, what if this were a book, a standalone book written by
Okay.
the perspective of Hagrid? Like
Mm.
he's in his world. It never really changes, like how do we introduce a world that is normal to this one guy in one book without info dumping? I know that that's hard to do.
It's really hard to do. Um, and it's funny because as we started this podcast talking about like my short story that turned into a novel,
Mhm.
I actually wrote that short story after listening to a podcast where there was a short story guru on that podcast, and he was talking about every short story, and actually every story he came on to say has there's a shattering moment in that story. It either happens before the story begins and the character's reacting to that shattering moment. It happens at the beginning, it happens toward the end. There's a moment where the world shatters and the story is about, in some way, a reaction to the normal world breaking. But I think that same challenge exists in short that he described in short stories, where the real world has to shatter and force the character to adapt. I think that's to avoid info dumping. I think you're also like, if your shattering moment, if that big act one moment is gonna be where the world changes for that hero, that hero's journey, depict that normal world and then break it up a little bit, right? That person, if it's about a breakup, the first act of that story is about, here's the world of their relationship. They break up. Now the world's different because he or she is looking at it from a jaded, hurt lover's perspective. And I think you have all those tools of point of view and characterization that's where they overlap. That interaction changes the world. Now the
So
world's different.
So you're saying that that Harry Potter first book where he's going in and totally seeing everything new for the first time, which is easier world building, is actually true for all stories. Once they hit that shattering mark and their world changes, everything's new. And now, that's interesting.
Right, because J.K. Rowling sets up this world where this kid is, this poor kid. Every time I have a closet that every time I open it, I think like,
Harry used to live here.
Right. But it's yeah, right. So he's in this normal world. And then when she breaks that and says, well, welcome to Hogwarts, because the reader is still reeling at that moment of change, because every reader was like, oh my God, like this isn't Privet Drive, this is a whole different thing. You buy yourself, right. You build yourself as a writer. I think you build yourself the opportunity to start layering in more things. Right now, you're contradicting the world you just built. This is a drab gray place with abusive aunt and uncle and some, what's his name, Dudley, being the most boring person in the world. Now you're with Hermione, and so I think those moments. I think you said be mindful of pacing, and I think like, be mindful of pacing and also be mindful of pivotal points in the story. When the story changes, you're rebuilding that world again.
Exactly. Also, per scene, you were, this was another thing I wanted to circle back on. You had said at one point that your critique group often says, oh, we don't need this. We don't need this. This is too much scene setting. Right. So the rule of thumb that I've used for a while is introductions. So someone once told me, when you introduce a character for the first time, this is the first time they've come on the screen, like you have to spend a little bit of time if they're a main character,
right,
or they will be, then spend some time, describing this person in an artful way, of course,
right.
Not necessarily what they look like, but just spend some time kind of introducing them. And I think the same is true for setting. So when you enter a new place for the first time, that's when you can set the stage and be, a little bit more micro on what's in the room and what's on the street. And then, like you said, with the smell, like you don't have to say it again, like they'll just know. When Harry went and saw that Diagon Alley entry, behind the bar the very first time, they spent some time on wonderful. That, like the squares, and I can't see it. And, there was some struggle there, which always reminds me of the labyrinth, the same thing when she's in the labyrinth and the worm's like, it's right there, just walk through the door and then you see it. So that whole scene setting is pretty micro. You really get into like what color the stones are and,
Right.
the sounds behind them in the bar and, the
Right.
feeling of what's going to happen and all that. But they never do that again.
Right. Then the next time they go into Diagon Alley, it's just,
It's
we
normal.
know that. Yeah.
Hit the button. Now we're in.
That's a big, yeah, I think that's a huge point when it comes to fantasy, sci-fi, those kind of things, is you're on that ship, that ship we're making up now, right? And
Mhm.
it's a science ship, and you've described this place. Then Act One breaks when the alarms go off, something is going wrong. That's your opportunity to describe that whole setting over again, right?
Mhm.
Okay, now it's with the alarms going, it's with the lights focusing, we're focusing on something new. That's a great, I never thought of it that way, but this idea of micro, you can get micro when those moments change,
Mhm.
and take advantage of that.
Mhm.
Don't if the smell didn't change, don't go and change that smell, but focus on what matters in
Right.
that moment. I really thought was interesting when he gets into Diagon Alley. I don't think the first book was that well written. Like the prose wasn't well written. I thought
Mhm.
the storytelling was beautiful, but I remember very clearly when he gets onto Diagon Alley, she gave like a sentence description of the ordinary faces in there. And that was, to me, like when I read that, like my writer heart went, that's beautiful, because like I need to know that
Mhm.
they're just, that to him they just look like ordinary people. That built the world to me in a
Mhm.
more profound way than she could have done in a lot of things. That wizards, and they look like everybody else, right? They walk among us, and that was just such great writing, and it was just so simple.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
really.
I think we kind of ran the gamut there. That was awesome.
That was a lot of fun. I
It
love,
was.
yeah.
Is there anything more? There's so much more we could talk
There's so
about.
much more, right? We should do a part two on this and keep going. Um, is there anything else? I don't know. I think I think if we're gonna have a leave behind, right? I think the leave behind is this is especially where like rewriting becomes a part of your practice, and that
Mhm.
is building the world and building the setting. It's challenging, it's inexact, and I think that probably if you're, especially if you're writing something like in any of the genres, not like just be trusting that you've got to build it, and you might have to rebuild it, is a part of that. You're gonna have to go back and look at it. You're gonna have to, but getting it out in that first draft is really important, because a lot of that world building is like, especially in fantasy and sci-fi, that's your bread and butter. That's your
That's
concept,
the
right?
premise. Yeah. Mhm.
That's that. So you don't want to limit the building of that premise by trying to curb your world building. So I think I would rather come to the end of a first draft with like an overbuilt world that I wanted to refocus, than a world that still needed building, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think that's just up to the writer. Like I would say maybe the opposite, because I mean, I
Hmm.
wish that I did write a little bit more world building in the first draft.
You're a building
But
up
I'm
from
a
draft one
building,
to
I'm an
draft two.
adder. Yeah, I'm not a
Okay.
taker outer, because I think that would hurt more, I think. Like I just wrote 20,000 words about how, this world operates and, who's in
You get
charge
to keep
and
two.
the government and like all the backstory stuff and why the world is the way it is. Like that stuff, I think really doesn't necessarily belong in the book in that way. Like you have to
Right.
bring it up somehow, but doing it through the interaction of character or setting and character.
This is a future topic, because I'm definitely I'm a put it all in and winnow it out and move some
Mhm.
of that stuff to the next draft. You're a build it up from that first draft to the draft you want person. It's like the plot and pants debate. Like, what's the best way to get through that first draft?
The one that gets all the words down.
The one that is that you hit it.
That's the podcast episode right there.
Right. Yeah, that's it.
Part two's
What's
done
right?
already.
Part two's done. Just finish. Get the words down. Um, I think it's also like, enjoy it. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're not enjoying the world you build, then you might be writing the wrong story, because
Well, I also like to think,
fun.
to close, I guess, I like to think of when I walk into a room a hotel room, a room in my house, a room in my friend's house, whatever, you get that vibe, you get the feeling of the room. Does it envelop you? Do you, what is it that you feel when you walk in the room? Does it feel not yours? Does it feel like stuff's just sort of hanging on the walls, or does it feel really inviting? And I kind of look at setting that way too. So I don't want the words to just hang on the page. Like, I want the reader to enter this room and be enveloped. And so I want to be able to write setting in that way.
Right.
And that's genre specific, like you said, and voice and all that. Well, there's so much more we could talk about, but I think that's a good spot to stop.
Yeah.
It was really fun. I like this topic.
Yeah, I love it too. We could talk for another hour, I'm sure.
All right.
Part two.
Have a great week. And
absolutely, you too.
Yeah, and keep writing, everybody, and revising.
Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.